Imagine trying to pick up a radio signal in the middle of a storm. The signal is there, it hasn't moved, but all you hear is static, and the longer you listen, the more you start to wonder whether there ever was a signal at all. That's a surprisingly accurate picture of where a lot of people find themselves spiritually. Not in full-blown doubt, not in crisis, just unable to tune in. Praying and feeling like the words dissolve before they arrive anywhere. Sitting in silence and finding only more silence. Going through the motions of faith while quietly wondering why it all feels so flat. Here's what I find genuinely fascinating about this. The problem might not be the signal. It might be the receiver. Because something is happening inside us, psychologically, neurologically, culturally, that is quietly making it harder to perceive anything subtle. And God, by most accounts, tends to speak very quietly indeed. There's a question a lot of people carry but rarely say out loud. Not does God exist? That's not quite it. It's something quieter and more personal than that. It's more like, why don't I feel God anymore? Maybe you'd describe it as spiritual dryness, or simply that God feels silent, that prayer feels empty, that faith, which once felt like something real and close, now feels abstract, like a belief you hold at arm's length, rather than something alive inside you. Whatever words you use for it, the experience tends to feel the same. You can believe something completely and still feel nothing when you pray. You can sit surrounded by people who seem genuinely moved and wonder, privately, what they're experiencing that you're not. You can read about a God described as close, present, and intimate, and feel like you're reading about someone else's relationship. That gap between what you believe and what you actually feel is one of the most disorienting places a person can live, and almost nobody talks about it honestly. When that gap appears, most people's minds go to the same place. It must be me. I'm doing something wrong. I'm not faithful enough, not consistent enough, not good enough. The silence becomes a verdict. But what if that interpretation is itself part of the problem? What if the reason you can't feel God's presence has far less to do with where God is, and far more to do with the condition of the internal space you're trying to sense Him through? Because there's something happening beneath the surface, something psychological, something deeply modern, that most conversations about spiritual distance never get close to. And understanding it might genuinely change the way you see this. Picture your inner life, your consciousness, your attention as a still body of water. This water acts like a lens. When it's calm and clear, you can see straight through it. You can perceive subtle things, quiet things, small movements beneath the surface. But when that water is disturbed, when it's churning, rippling, spinning, the clarity disappears entirely. Everything looks distorted, fragmented, wrong. That is what anxiety does to your inner life. And the modern world has become extraordinarily good at creating ripples, the constant notifications, the low-level hum of financial pressure, the news feed algorithmically designed to trigger your threat response. Your nervous system was never built for this volume of input, and it's quietly struggling under the weight of it. When anxiety is running high, something very specific happens to your spiritual perception. Silence starts to feel threatening rather than restful. You reach inward and find only noise. And almost without realizing it, your mind begins interpreting that silence as rejection, as absence, as punishment, as evidence that something is wrong. It's not a theological conclusion. It's an anxious one. Research in the psychology of religion has documented this clearly. People experiencing higher anxiety consistently perceive God as more distant, more inconsistent, more cold, as though God feels far away, not because He has moved, but because the lens they're looking through has been distorted by everything pressing in on them from the outside. The water is spinning, and you're trying to see clearly through a storm. But anxiety isn't the only way the water gets disturbed. Sometimes it doesn't spin violently. Sometimes it goes the other direction entirely. Sometimes it just goes still in the wrong way. Heavy, dense, like water slowly turning to something thicker. That's burnout. And in an age of chronic exhaustion, it's one of the most underreported reasons why faith feels hard. Burnout doesn't keep you wired. Eventually, it makes you numb. And numbness, in its own quiet way, is a kind of mercy. It's your mind and body saying, I've been running at full capacity for too long. I need to start closing things down just to keep you functional. The problem is that among the things that quietly close down is your capacity for what researchers call absorption, the ability to be fully, unhurriedly present to a moment, to let something in, to be genuinely moved. You can sit somewhere that once felt sacred and feel nothing. You can read words that once meant something and they land completely flat. You can pray and feel like you're reciting from a script to an empty room. This isn't a crisis of faith. It's depletion. When the water shield becomes too heavy, too foggy, light simply cannot pass through it cleanly. And the mistake, the deeply human mistake, is to look at that fog and conclude that the light itself is gone. Here's something that rarely gets discussed, but I think it's one of the most important pieces of this whole picture. Sensing God, really perceiving that quiet presence, isn't purely a passive gift that descends randomly on the deserving. It's also, at least in part, a skill, a trained attentional capacity that can be developed, and just as quietly, lost. The anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann spent years studying how people actually experience God in prayer, and one of her central findings was striking. The people who heard God most clearly had all, in some way, learned to cultivate a very specific quality of inner attention. A focused, patient, inward listening. The kind of quiet concentration that allows you to notice something subtle moving through your thoughts. This is precisely the capacity that modern life is slowly dismantling. Every time you reach for your phone out of boredom, every time you fill a silence with noise before it has a chance to become anything, you are training your brain to flee from stillness, teaching your attention to chase the next peripheral flash rather than rest in the quiet. And slowly, without a single dramatic moment, you lose the ability to do the one thing that spiritual perception seems to genuinely require. We live in an age of unprecedented noise, and then we wonder why we can't hear what has always been described as a still, small voice. There's one more layer to this worth sitting with, and it's perhaps the most personal. Psychologists have found that people tend to experience God through a lens shaped, at least partly, by their earliest and most formative relationships. If the people who were supposed to be safe and reliable were sometimes warm and sometimes withdrawn, sometimes present, sometimes entirely absent, something in us learns to expect that pattern. Not just from people, but everywhere, including from God. And this creates a split that is surprisingly common among people experiencing spiritual dryness. Someone can believe, intellectually, that God is loving, close, and good. They can say it, mean it, defend it in conversation. And at the same time, their felt experience, the deep, body-level experience, is that he's cold or indifferent, or simply not there for them specifically. The head knows one thing. The heart has quietly learned another. When anxiety or burnout is already present, the heart version tends to win. Prayer stops feeling worth the effort because some part of you already expects to be ignored. You read about God's love, but you feel his disapproval. You interpret the silence not as rest, but as evidence of something you've done or failed to do. This is what some researchers call divine struggle, and it sits at the root of a lot of what people describe as losing faith or feeling disconnected from God. It's not a spiritual defect, it's a human one, and it's far more common than most people will openly admit. So when God feels this distant, when the silence has gone on this long, where does that actually leave us? I want to offer something here that I think is both honest and worth holding on to. Not a quick fix, because there isn't one, but a different way of understanding what's actually happening when the signal goes quiet. The Christian tradition has always known that God doesn't show up the way we expect him to. In 1 Kings, the prophet Elijah is burned out, depleted, and completely empty. He's fled into the wilderness, collapsed under a tree, and asked to die. And God doesn't meet him with drama or vision or fire from heaven. He sends an angel with bread and water. He says simply, "The journey is too much for you. Rest." And when Elijah finally reaches the mountain where he expected to encounter God, there is wind, earthquake, and fire. But God is not in any of them. God is in the still, small voice, the gentle whisper, the thing you almost dismiss. This is not a minor detail. It's a theological truth about the nature of divine presence. It tends to come quietly, in the margins, in the passing moments. Not as a sustained emotional state you can hold and examine, but as something more like a glimpse, a sudden warmth, a thought that feels subtly different from the rest. One theologian describes this as the dynamic of passing, presence that moves through rather than stays. And here is the implication. If you've been waiting for the feeling of God's presence to return and remain, you may have been waiting for something that was never quite the promise. Presence, in this understanding, isn't something you possess. It's something that finds you when you're still enough to notice it. One more image before we close. Think about an elite athlete and their coach. In the beginning, the coach is right there, instructing, correcting, walking alongside every step. But as the athlete develops, something deliberately changes. The coach steps back. Not out of coldness, not from loss of interest, but because the most important growth now has to happen in the athlete, not with the coach providing constant reassurance. The coach who holds your hand through everything is ultimately the coach who limits how far you go. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the spiritual dryness we experience, the seasons where God feels silent, serve something similar. They are the space where we discover what we actually believe when the feeling is absent, where faith stops being a response to what we receive and starts being something we offer without guarantee of immediate return. That's not abandonment. In the Christian understanding, it may be one of the more quietly significant invitations a person ever receives, to stop relating to God purely through feeling and start relating to him through something slower, deeper, and harder to shake. So if you've been sitting in that silence, unable to feel God's presence, quietly wondering if you're doing something wrong, here is what I want to leave you with. The silence is not empty. You are not being punished. The distance is not the end of the story. What's more likely is that the lens you're trying to perceive through has been disturbed by anxiety, by exhaustion, by a world that has become almost hostile to the kind of stillness that spiritual perception seems to need. And the path back isn't to feel more, it's to get quieter. We avoid silence because silence is a mirror. When everything else finally goes still, we stop being distracted from ourselves. And that can be uncomfortable, especially if what we find is pain or emptiness or a reflection we don't quite recognize. But in the Christian tradition, God has never been frightened of what he finds in us. The invitation isn't to arrive when you're better or calmer or more together. It's to come as you are, into the stillness you've been avoiding, and trust that something waits there that noise has been drowning out. You haven't lost God. You've lost the quiet. And quiet, unlike so many things, is something you can return to. Start small. 5 minutes. No filling the space. Just sit long enough for the ripples to begin to settle. The signal hasn't moved. If this resonated with you, if you've been living in that static, drop a word in the comments, even just quiet or static. I'll know what you mean.